Welcome to the Trombone Corner Podcast, where we feature interviews with trombonists from all over the globe. It's great to have you join us as we talk all things trombone. Brought to you by the Brass Ark and Bob Reeves Brass. This is your host, John Snell from Bob Reeves Brass, along with some help from Noah Gladstone of the Brass Ark. Noah, thanks for joining us today. How are you doing?
I'm doing well, John. How are you?
I am doing absolutely wonderful. Thank you for asking.
You're looking well today, too, by the way.
It's the coffee.
You look fabulous.
It's the coffee.
I know. What kind of coffee are you drinking these days?
It's straight up pour over with a little bit of soy milk.
Very nice. Very California.
Very California. Well, it's unlike this weather. It's raining out today. I don't know what to do.
That's true. It is.
So I saw a meme last night about, we've had 24 hours of cloud. So check on your Southern California friends to make sure they're not getting depressed without sunshine.
I know, right? It's been a strange year so far with all the rain. Mm-hmm. I'm sure a lot of our listeners have seen all the news. We have got a lot of rain. The atmospheric rivers out here. It's kind of a wild phenomenon. I haven't seen it since El Nino back in the late 90s. Has it rained like this? Mm-hmm. But hopefully, clear skies ahead.
Clear skies.
I don't know if our roofs can handle it much more. Today we have James Nova from the Pittsburgh Symphony, second trombonist in that orchestra. Fantastic player, phenomenal musician, very famous for his multi-tracking YouTube videos, which we will talk about a lot in this podcast. So make sure you all stay tuned. This is going to be a really fun one.
I believe he calls them Nova dubs.
That's right. He calls them Nova dubs.
We will talk about Nova dubs later after a word from our sponsors and some trombone news.
Hello, loyal listeners. This is Noah Gladstone. I founded the Brass Ark in 2010 to celebrate the love and passion for legendary brass craftsmanship. I wanted to share my joy for the best gear and bring it to the forefront of musicians' minds through the development and cultivation of modern equipment, with roots firmly established in the classic designs of the vintage masters. Bob Reeves Brass is a world-renowned mouthpiece maker of the highest quality and has been handcrafting mouthpieces for professional trumpet players for over 50 years. Together, we are excited to bring a premium line of handcrafted mouthpieces to the trombone community, inspired by rare and vintage classics and modernized for the needs of today's musician. Models are available in a variety of sizes, from small and large tenor, bass, trombone, euphonium, as well as custom sizes. We also have artist models available, as used by David Rejano, Jay Friedman, and Charlie Vernon. Visit brassark.com or trombonemouthpiece.com for more information, and remember to follow us on Instagram at the Brass Ark and at Bob Reeves Brass. Back to you, John.
Well, first, I'd like to give a shout out to all the folks that came by the Bob Reeves Brass booth at TMEA in a few weeks ago. We had a lot of folks come by to try the Brass Ark and Bob Reeves mouthpieces, the mutes, the guard bags, all of the stuff. And a lot of you mentioned that you were fans of the podcast, and a lot of you really enjoyed our collaboration with the Third Coast guys. So thank you to all that came by our TMEA booth. And also, I don't know, you got a bunch of emails, right, from that last episode?
Oh, yeah. A lot of people really, really enjoyed that crossover. I mean, we had so much fun making it. It was a real high point in our podcasting so far, I think, just to hang with those guys and be on their podcast and then on our podcast. And it was kind of a neat format. So maybe we'll do some more of those. I just got a lot of nice positive feedback from everybody and how interesting everybody was. So appreciate y'all for listening. John, I heard you had some nice barbecue in Texas too.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. We did a field trip from San Antonio up to Austin to go to Interstellar. And I'll post some pictures of it because it was to die for. we actually bought too much and then brought it back to our room and had it in San Antonio all week. The whole room, our booth smelled like barbecue. It's about as Texas as you can get, short of a cowboy hat.
I mean, that's a good way to attract brass players.
Oh yeah. Maybe that was it. Maybe that was a secret. I mean, the traffic at our booth was probably the best we've ever had. So maybe it was, we were just.
Maybe it was Interstellar barbecue.
It was.
There you go.
Yeah. So shout out to those guys.
Ends.
Yeah. If you're in and around Austin, go to Interstellar Barbecue. It is literally the best in the world, and they're super nice folks. So shout out to those guys. The other thing I wanted to mention is if you didn't listen to the last podcast, check it out. It's on Spotify and Apple Podcasts and YouTube and all of those places, because you missed out on a lot of fun. And we did a collaboration, as we mentioned, with the Third Coast guys. So you can listen to their podcast and they chat with Noah and I on there. And very kind of them to include a soprano trombonist in with the club.
Let's see. I have some trombone news. I guess we can talk about.
Yeah, what do you got going on?
Well, crazy enough, the Brass Ark is moving to a new shop. I've been in my current location about 10 years. A lot of you have probably visited me before and know how small it is. Very exciting. Brad Close and I are moving into a new shop just a couple blocks down that is about 4 times the size of our current spot, and very, very nice. So I will have actually a proper display for the first time of some of my museum instruments, as well as new instruments for sale and a lot more space. So definitely, please keep an eye out on the website for a new address. If you want to come by, make an appointment, and see the new space, that would be great. I already apologize for being a little late on shipping while I'm moving everything out and reorganizing everything. So it's a little bit crazy at the Brass Ark right now, but hopefully it's going to be really, really awesome in a positive direction. I'm just thrilled with this space. And John, you actually saw it with me.
It's
a
really
beautiful
exciting.
spot.
Yeah.
So
beautiful building. So yeah, I can't wait to get, and you're going to put a pinball table.
we
in,
will
right?
put a pinball table, one of my pinball tables there. And an interesting fun fact, actually, this was an old machine shop called Hamilton Tool. A long time ago. They were there for 40 years, and they're actually the first machinist that made my original Brass Ark 5G prototype mouthpieces. So I'm now in the building that my original mouthpiece line was kind of started before we started the collaboration with Bob Reeves. So nice little circle there and tidbit of trivia.
So cool. Well, congratulations on the move.
Thank you. Thank you.
We have a couple things going on at the shop. Probably the biggest news is, if you heard last episode, we are now proudly carrying Shire's instruments, and of course the wonderful Shire's trombones. And as you know, they're a commodity, especially the customs are hard to get in. And we're very fortunate. We have, I think, 6 or 7 customs now in the shop. Bass trombones, a couple bass trombones, a couple large bore tenors, a couple small bore tenors. So feel free to come by the shop and give them a blow, or you can call us or email us. Our trombone staff, Robert Coomber and Spencer Schaefer, both fabulous professional trombonists in their own right, are happy to assist you and give you the details on those great instruments. And we also have some Q series too. Not as hard to come by, but also fabulous instruments at a great value. So very, very excited to develop this relationship with Shires. We've been fans of theirs for a long time, and they used to have a big presence here in Los Angeles. And the last, I don't know, 5 or 6 years or so, maybe longer, they've basically non-existent out here. So, of course, with David Rayano and Jim Miller and a number of the players out here using Shires, it's nice to have finally a place that folks can come in and try them.
You actually have David's model in stock too, right? So very exciting.
Not for much longer.
Yeah.
There was someone that was going to get it this week, I believe. But we have another one coming. So yeah, it's again, fun horns. And we were doing some videos. I got Robert and Spencer recording on some of the horns up in the front this week. So we'll be posting those. So not only can you see the horns, you'll also be able to hear them played if you want to check them out.
Sounds great.
So that's all we have on the radar. I mean, ITF is not too far away, considering this is early March, and ITF, I think, is end of May this year, a little bit earlier. So it looks like it's going to be a banger of a conference this year, and we will be there again. So make sure that's on your calendar and come out and have some trombone fun. All right, that's all I got. Anything else, Noah?
I think that's it. Let's get to our interview with Jim Nova.
James Nova, a trombonist with a deep passion for the music of John Williams, has made a significant impact in the world of music through his inventive arrangements and performances. Starting his journey with a fascination for Williams's scores in Star Wars, Nova has transcended his early inspirations to become a vital member of the Pittsburgh Symphony Orchestra. Known for his remarkable ability to arrange complex trombone choir pieces, Jim's work, including his notable album A Fall from Light to Dark, showcases his unique blend of technical mastery and creative artistry. His career has been marked by performances with prestigious groups such as the Boston Symphony and collaborations with luminaries like John Williams, solidifying his position as a respected figure in the classical music scene. And now, here's our interview with Jim Nova. All right, joining us in the Trombone Corner today is Jim Nova. Jim, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
And I mean, normally we start off from the very beginning about how you started playing trombone, but we want to mix things up a little bit because there was a little bit of controversy in our last episode with Sebastian and Nick about how good you actually are at soprano trombone. And I see you have it in the background there. So should we clear things up?
Yeah, I mean, it was a little bit of ribbing there. I mean, I think Sebastian intended to. I mean, what he said was like, "Oh yeah, he's okay at it," and I was like, "I'm okay at it." Hang on a second here, like, and I think he had good intentions, of course.
Oh
but,
yeah,
we like to give each other crap about stuff all the time. So it's
well, it's like when your significant other comes out and you say, "Oh yeah, you look fine,"
Right. Yeah. Does this trumpet make me look fat?
Yeah. And we'll get into the soprano trombone more a little bit later. I have mine here. But let's get into it. Let's start with how you started playing trombone. Take us back to the very beginning.
Wow. Well, as most people who know me know that John Williams played a huge influence on my young playing career. I mean, and so if you really want to start at the beginning, I went to see The Empire Strikes Back in the theater. And, my older brother and my dad and I went to see it. And, that hearing that music, especially that particular score, hearing that music in the theater just definitely laid some groundwork that, a few years later when it came time, because I was 6 years old when I went to see it. So I hadn't even started playing an instrument yet. And when it got time to choose an instrument, the brass family naturally attracted me because I just love that music, and they needed trombone players basically. And I thought, well, that thing looks kind of cool. I think I'll play that, and it kind of went from there. I mean, my early background is, my dad is, this is a very strange sentence to say, but he is a classically trained accordion player. He actually, when I sort of have like, I don't know if you guys ever listen to that podcast, The Moth. They have like a pitch line for it when you go in. And this would be my pitch line for a Moth story, is that when I was a kid, I remember having a conversation with my dad and saying, "Okay, Dad, so you and Mom were both born in Istanbul, Turkey, but we're not actually Turkish. You and Mom are both descended from Albanian families who fled Albania during the communist takeover to Istanbul. So you and Mom were both born and raised in Istanbul. So, but we have an Italian last name, Nova. It's like an Italian last name. So why do we live in the U.S. and why do I speak fluent Greek? Are we in some kind of like Balkan? Are we in some kind of Balkan witness protection program or something? Like, what's going on here?" And so that's basically my cultural background. But my dad, he wanted to be a musician when he was a kid, and his dad basically said, "Look, play your brother's old accordion." And so he became like a virtuoso at the accordion. I mean, he actually can play like Beethoven piano sonatas on accordion and stuff, So
wow.
He went to he learned how to speak German 6 months before he moved there to study at a music school in Germany, in Trossingen, Germany. And there's a place called the Honor Academy. Honor is like the big company that makes accordions in Germany and still does, I think. And so he went to that music school, and my dad actually met and studied with Paul Hindemith, if you can believe it.
Really?
Hindemith after World War II, when Hindemith started coming back to Germany, he would go and do these like residencies at various schools, and that's my dad worked with him at one of these residencies. And so
fascinating.
It's kind of nuts. And he studied theory and composition and all the trappings of a normal music education. when he and my mom and my, then 5-year-old brother moved to the US, he settled in New York City, and he tried to make a living as a musician, but it just doesn't, turned out there wasn't a lot of work for accordion players in the 70s, and so my grandfather on my dad's side ran a big restaurant. And so my dad knew the restaurant business. So he just opened a pizza restaurant, and basically always had classical music playing in the house, and taught me music from a very young age, and that's part of the reason I'm so drawn to movie music, I think, is because my dad made music very visual for me. He would like tell me the story of the piece. And, like I remember him acting out parts of Firebird for me when I was a little kid, when I'm listening to the record. And, so music was very plentiful in our house growing up. And my dad had a rule with his two sons. He said, you both will play instruments until you finish high school. You can choose what instrument you want to play, but I will get you lessons and all this stuff, and so it was like not a question of if, it was a question of which instrument, like he believed in the power of music education to help all subjects, not just being a musician. In fact, I think he was a little nervous when I decided to become a full-time to go into music, given his background, so but my real origin story is kind of a sad one, actually, because my parents, when they came to the U.S., I think my mom was less adventurous than my dad. I think she knew that it was going to be in our family's best interest to come to the U.S., and he wanted a better life for his family. And my dad served in the Turkish military, and at that time there was this big controversy over the island of Cyprus between the Greeks and the Turks. And there was like all this armed conflict happening there. And my dad kind of saw the handwriting on the wall and just didn't want to be around for that. And he thought, I'm going to have a better life in the US. And so there was some family who had come to the US ahead of us. So he had somewhat of a network of family that, he could connect with in the US. But when I was like, basically freshman year of high school, I had this, I still have it, actually. It's over here, this Yamaha student model horn that I was playing on when I was a kid. And I started taking lessons with the Hartford Symphony second trombone player. George Sanders is his name. And wonderful teacher, really wonderful teacher. And he, after a couple months of lessons, he was like, he talked to my parents and he said, look, your son's very talented, and he's completely outgrown this instrument. He really needs a serious instrument, and at that time, that was the 80s, there wasn't really many choices. It was like you either played a Bach 42 or a Con 88H, that was those were kind of your choices, And my teacher was a Bach 42 player, and so I kind of gravitated to that. And so, even though my parents ran a restaurant, we were pretty modest middle class income family. And so for them to spend a whole whopping $1,100 on a Bach 42, that was a lot of money. That was a lot of money for them. And I still have it. It's right over here. In fact, I've had it like this horn. I've had it like all converted over so that it actually is completely compatible with all my Shires stuff. And it's pretty cool. I mean, I had a lead pipe put on it, so you can take an actual lead pipe receiver, and then when you put my axial valve on it, it's actually a pretty good horn. But without those two things, it was a terrible horn. It was, in fact, I'm convinced that, it's no secret that my high chops are kind of, how do I put this delicately? Insane. I think they developed half the reason they developed that way was in spite of this horn. It's like they had to be strong in order for me to play that horn in the high range, but anyway, so my parents bought me this Bach 42, and that was like April of my freshman year of high school. And even though my mom was only 51, she was, we didn't realize, but she was in some pretty serious health distress at that point. She suffered a massive heart attack in July of that year, and she died. And I was home. I was like the one who had to call 911 and have the ambulance do all those things that you see happen in a TV show, and that's a hell of a lot to see and experience as a 15-year-old kid, because you're old enough to know what's going on, but you're nowhere near old enough to have the life experience to absorb that, and, I just remember, my dad coming home from, cause like everybody leapt into action. My dad was at the restaurant, which my mom and dad ran together. My dad was at the restaurant with my brother, and, he rushed to the hospital. And, I remember when he came home and he got out of the car, I could see it on his face. And, he said, one of the most chilling things I've ever heard. He said, Jim, they had all that technology and they couldn't save her. And, so, not to be a downer, but it was in that sort of fire of tragedy that, up until that point, I loved playing and music was very important to me, but it was something I was good at and I enjoyed it and I had fun doing it. And it completely changed meaning for me then. Because then I just that horn was like, such a totem to her support of my musical career. My mom was the kind of parent who would like sneak into school assemblies that she wasn't supposed to be at and like to hear me play if I was playing in something, like she was just this incredibly supportive parent. And, so it was music. I like to say that music stopped being something that I do and it became something that I am. And, so that fall after she had passed away, my dad had this subscription to the Hartford Symphony, and I grew up in central Connecticut, and so he took me to see Mahler Fifth Symphony, and I just remember that crossroad of like that tragedy and that piece of music, the way it starts with the dark funeral march and ends triumphantly, and and I just was transfixed by that. And at the end of the concert, I remember just standing up and just like pointing at the orchestra and saying, I was like, yeah, I want to do that. I want to do that. And so that was it. It was like I was a lightning bolt at that point. I knew right then that this is what I'm going to do with my life. It's what I want to do. And it's something I tell students, especially in high school students, when I talk to their parents or something like that. My wife runs a youth orchestra here in Pittsburgh, and she's the executive director. And so I, cross paths with a lot of students, and I teach at Duquesne University as well. So I'm always working with students. And I like to say that I think everybody should study music, no matter what age level, no matter what experience level, what profession level. I think everybody should study music, but nobody should go into it for a living. And then I just let that sit there for a second. And then I say, unless the sun rises and sets by music for you, you can see yourself doing nothing else. Because even if that's the case, you're in for a long life of brushing yourself off and picking yourself up and suffering through lots of rejections and failures and trials and difficulties. And even after you have, I'm turning 50 in June, and even it's like now that I'm kind of looking back on the last 30 years and thinking like, yeah, even after I was successful at this, there's trials of like, going through, the Pittsburgh Symphony went on strike in 2016, and going through those trials and the existential crises of that. And then, having chop issues and, colleagues having chop issues, and just seeing all those trials. It's like, even after you're successful, you still have to be good at brushing yourself off and picking yourself up.
It's very much a
anyway,
mental
game.
Yeah.
So when I got towards the end of high school, I didn't know anything. I was just this kid, this punk kid from the cornfields of Connecticut. I didn't know who Joe Alessi was. I didn't know who Blair Bollinger. I didn't know who Glenn Dodson was. I didn't know any of these people. And my teacher was like, "You should audition for Curtis." I was like, "What's that?" And he goes, "It's free." And I was like, "Okay, I'll do that." And I think that was my best advantage, actually, because I went in totally not knowing what I was up against, and that that they only take one trombone player a year, and it's full scholarship. And Joe Alessi went to school there, and that I found that all out later. I didn't even, I think the first time I heard the name Joe Alessi was I was walking down the hall at Curtis, and I saw a graduation photo from 1981, and there was his name, and I was like, "Oh, who's that?" That's how green I was. I mean, like,
Wow.
my first year at Curtis, the trombone section was like, "Hey, let's get together and play some excerpts." I was like, "Okay." They're like, "Let's play the chorale from Mahler 2." I was like, "What's that?" They're like, "You don't know that? Oh, you'll love it. Let's play the chorale from Brahms 4." I was like, "What's that? I don't know that." And they're like, "Do you know anything?" And I was like, Brahms 1 and Enigma variations and Shostakovich 5. And they're like, "Oh, dude." And then we just sat there and played excerpts for hours. And I was like, "Man, I didn't even know this stuff was here." So that's how green I was, but like I said, I was a lightning bolt. Music was just so important to me at that point after the tragedy I'd suffered, that it was just like, Dodson once said that after I graduated, he said, "Jim, you were one of those kind of kids that needed to be steered, not motivated." Like, he's like, "I had to, like, just, you were like a, like a car without a steering wheel that had a V8 engine in it, like, you just needed to be steered." But yeah. And so, that's, that was my time at Curtis. And, my dad was relieved at that point, because, when I decided to go into music, he was worried that I was going to suffer through the same setbacks and losses that he had in his music career,
Mhm.
but he just kept plugging away at his restaurant. And, I made my way through Curtis. And then there was a guy who came to Curtis to study bass trombone who was from the Boston area. Now, when I was in high school, I played in the New England Conservatory Youth Orchestra. I would actually take, if you want to know what a nut job I am, I would take a bus from Connecticut to I'd take a bus from Connecticut to Boston to play in Ben Zander's youth orchestra at New England Conservatory, right? And so there was this one time where my dad was driving me to the bus station, and the guy in the oncoming traffic ran the light, and, like, we basically hit him head on. And because we were kind of running late, I had unclipped my seatbelt and was, like, gathering my music and stuff in the back seat to get ready to basically hop out of the car and get on the bus so that I wouldn't be late. So I didn't have my seatbelt on for a split second, and we hit the car head on, and I hit my head on the windshield and cracked the windshield, and, like, got out of the car. And then the police show up, and they're writing up the accident report. And they're like, "We got to get you into an ambulance and get you over to, get you evaluated for a concussion." I was like, "What, are you kidding? I'm not missing a week of Mahler 5 or Shostakovich 5. I was like, "We're doing Shostakovich 5 in youth orchestra. I'm not missing that." And I refused to stay. I grabbed my horn and walked the rest of the way to the bus station and got on the bus, and, like, splitting headache. I mean, I'm sure I had a mild concussion, and I'm sitting there blasting through Shostakovich 5,
Oh my gosh.
and
It
so
is a
that's,
great piece of music. No question
yeah,
about
I
it.
mean, yeah. And if you're going to play a piece with a concussion, that's a pretty good one to
That's a
play.
good one to do
Yeah.
it. Yeah,
Yeah.
sure. Noted.
Yeah. But so that's the kind of kid I was. But so when this guy who came to Curtis to study, he's from Boston, and I didn't know who Norman Bolter was that well at that point, but he just spoke, glowingly about him and what it was like to study with him and work with him. And so I sought him out, and this is before we had computers in our pockets that could look people up and blah blah blah. So it was all word of mouth, and I he said, "Oh, you got to listen to the Empire Brass recording of the Ewald quintets, and you got to listen to this Mahler 7 recording of Norman playing euphonium. You got to listen to these Boston Pops performance, and so I just became intrigued, and but I hadn't, up to this point, I had only listened to recordings, so I didn't know what he looked like. And so I set up a lesson with him. I show up at Symphony Hall in Boston, and he comes up to the stage door, and it must have been written all over my face. He was, "Jim?" And I was like, "Yeah." And he looks at me and he goes, "You thought I'd be bigger, didn't you?" And sure enough, because, if for those who don't know who Norman Bolter is, he's like 5'5" and, buys his shoes in the boys section of stores. I think he's a size 6 shoe or something like that,
Jeez.
And so, that's why his students, myself included, affectionately refer to him as like the Yoda of the trombone, because he is very small package, big sound, big music, big musicianship, and so, and speaking of trials and difficulties, when I got to about my junior year at Curtis, that's when I started taking lessons with him. I was not in a good way. I was not in a good place. I basically, Curtis is an amazing school, and I have nothing but admiration for it and fond memories for the most part. But it can be a tough environment, because it's almost like this culture of, if you get your degree, you failed. Like the highest honor is you're supposed to win a job in X number of X name orchestra before you graduate. Like that's sort of the highest honor. And it didn't help that like both Norman Bolter and Glenn Dodson were examples of that. I mean, Norman didn't go to Curtis, but he never finished his degree before he got into Boston Symphony, and then neither did Glenn Dodson. So, so it was tough. I was really hard on myself, and I was like, I'm not getting better fast enough. I'm not going to win a job. I'm not going to blah, 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 and Norman was the one who kind of steered me back to that like childlike wonder and love of music and playing. And, he loves to say things like, "Jim, you got to remember, it's not important who wrote the music. It's important what wrote the music." And, things like that. That's kind of the way Norman talks, and he's amazing. He's still putting out great content too. And, I owe a huge debt of gratitude to him for steering me away from the cliff, because I literally was about to quit. I mean, when I was in high school, I was a pretty good student, and my guidance counselors were all flipping out at me because I was slowly pulling myself out of AP classes to do more music stuff, to play in more ensembles and things like that. And one of my guidance counselors was like, "Jim, you're on track to be like the valedictorian of your class. You're blowing it here. You're not going to make a living blowing on that horn." And I was like, I think you're wrong. I think this is what I want to do. Like, and so it's amazing how these trials, come up,
What would you have done if you hadn't been a trombonist?
Yeah. Yeah. I'd probably be, I mean, if I hadn't gone into trombone, I mean, I was definitely heading towards, like I probably could have been pre-med or like a lawyer or something, or engineering really interested me a lot. It's probably why I'm such a equipment dork, and it's funny because my wife's a horn player, and she doesn't play a whole lot anymore, but she's a terrific horn player. And she had her horn, like had the bell cut at some point, like years ago. And she's like, "I can't tell the difference." I was like, "What do you mean you can't tell the difference? It can't possibly play the same as it did before." And she goes, "Look, I don't know. It doesn't, I don't, if I don't clock my mouthpiece the way I like it, I can tell, like one time I was like wiping my mouthpiece off after a practice session. I just left my horn down, and then I picked it up and I went to play, and I was like, "Oh, that feels weird." And I looked down, and it was a quarter turn, the mouthpiece was a quarter turn different than where I like to put it. And I could tell. And I was like, I wish I couldn't tell, but but I can, But anyway, so naturally, when it came time for graduate school, Norman really attracted me, and I ended up going to New England Conservatory for my master's, and that's where I finally crossed paths on the concert stage with John Williams, and so I had been such a huge fan of his, and you can actually see that picture in the background over there. That's
the one.
Yeah, that's the concert premiere. That was right after I graduated, though. That was the concert premiere of music from Episode 1, Star Wars Episode 1, The Phantom Menace. It's like backstage, and gotten to play with him. I mean, somebody asked me recently, because he just came to Pittsburgh in December, and somebody asked me how many concerts I think I've played with him, and I was like, it's hard for me to count. It's like well over 100. Because in Boston, I played all the time with him, and he would do like 5 shows a week and come there for a couple of weeks, and then played him in Tanglewood. And, so yeah, I mean, it was that going to Boston and playing the Boston Pops and the Boston Symphony as an extra, was a huge, huge boost to my, my career. In fact, one of the early auditions I took, when I was in graduate school was for the Pacific Symphony. And I took that audition. That would have been 1998, I think. And Mike Hoffman was the second trombone player at the time, and he won. It was weird, because I just heard an interview with Bill Booth recently, and I've never met Bill, but I mean, I've been a huge fan of his playing for ages, and there was some controversy with him. Like, he was the principal, and something happened, and he was no longer the principal. So I don't want to talk out of school. I don't know what happened there, but maybe he had missed too many services, or it just wasn't working in his schedule anymore. And so I don't know why he resigned, but he did. And so there was this principal opening, and Mike ended up winning the job, and I ended up being the runner-up. And so they offered me the second job in Pacific. And I went out there and I did it for about a year. I would fly back and forth from Boston, and I'd go out there. And I have a friend who I went to school with, a trumpet player named Jason Gamer. I don't know if he's still.
I just saw Jason this weekend, believe it or not.
When did you see Jason?
We just played the gig together last weekend. So.
No kidding. Oh, yeah. Well, if you see him again, please tell him I said hello.
I'll text him right now and say we're doing a podcast. He'll freak out.
That's great. That's great. Yeah, he and I were classmates at Curtis together, and so, I knew he was there, and I don't know if his dad's retired at this point, but at that point, his dad was a Beverly Hills dentist, and I think Tom Hanks was one of his clients. So crazy small world. But Jason was gracious enough to let me stay with him when I would go out there and play. And I'm not sure if it's still this way, but Pacific used to be at that time was a per service orchestra, so they would do like a whole bunch of services, and then there'd be weeks off and services and blah blah. So I was trying to balance that with all the freelancing I was doing in Boston. I was, in addition to being a first call sub for the Boston Symphony and Boston Pops, I was like principal of the Rhode Island Philharmonic, principal of the Vermont Symphony, second trombone New Haven, and so I think I was putting like 25,000 miles a year on my car, just driving to all these places and stuff. I'd stay with my dad in Connecticut when I'd play in New Haven, and but anyway, that not to jump ahead. I mean, but I went to the Utah Symphony after freelancing in Boston. But what put the Pittsburgh Symphony on my radar was, and it's especially interesting because we just played Prokofiev Romeo and Juliet this past week. We played a big suite from the full ballet, not just the concert suites. It was hearing the Pittsburgh Symphony play that on the radio that inspired me to want to play in that orchestra, because I was this was back when I was freelancing in New England. I came out of a New Haven Symphony concert to find my car broken into, and this was the phase of my career where you take a $5,000 instrument and put it in the trunk of a $500 car to play a $50 gig.
Mm-hmm.
So and I come out to the car, it's broken into, and it's winter. And so I'm like, I'm leaning forward, putting the heater on full blast, and trying to drive up, I-90 to get to my dad's house. And I turn the radio on, and I hear this performance of The Death of Tybalt from, Prokofiev, Romeo and Juliet. And it's already started. So I don't know who's playing. I was like, man, what is this orchestra? And so I pull over to a rest area and stop so I can hear with no wind noise coming in from the broken window, and it gets to the end and the huge big brass finish. And I was like, who the hell is this orchestra? And the local radio guy, Jim Cunningham is his name. He's still plugging away here. He says, you're listening live to the Pittsburgh Symphony from Heinz Hall, and Morris Janssen's on the podium. And I was like, man. And then that's when I became really interested in that orchestra specifically, because, I just was blown away by that performance. But I went to the Utah Symphony after freelancing, and played there for 8 years. And ironically, one of the first things I did in the orchestra was my first season in Utah was the year that the Winter Olympics were in Salt Lake City.
That's right.
And so, yeah, John Williams came out and did the theme to the Winter Olympics with the Utah Symphony and the Mormon Tabernacle Choir, and so I saw him there, and I can't give enough thanks to my colleagues in Utah for helping me prepare. I mean, I took 16 auditions while I lived in Utah, for other jobs, and they were always so gracious helping me prepare, and Larry Zalkin and Rusty McKinney and Gary Offenlock, the section there, they were always gracious about playing through section things with me and and so when I won the Pittsburgh job, it was a huge thing, and I couldn't be more grateful to them for their help. Especially Gary, because Gary, I don't know if you guys know Gary Offenlock, but he would just stay after concerts with me and listen to me play excerpts. And, he was like a big brother to me in a lot of ways. He's now retired from Utah, but so yeah, I came to Pittsburgh, and then a few years after I was here, John Williams actually came to do a concert here, and then he saw me and he was puzzled, and I saw him in the wings, and he was like, all right, I'm confused. Now you're here? And I said, yeah, I'm in the trombone witness protection program. We're just moving us from one orchestra to another. And, and he was like, oh, well, congratulations. This is a terrific orchestra, and what a brass section, So, and he's been back a couple times since, but yeah. So career wise, that's kind of been my trajectory,
I want to go back a little bit and talk about the first time you met John Williams. I mean,
sure.
What was that like? I mean, just as you said, you were born into the Star Wars world and grew up with that. I mean, how did you go? You got your picture taken with him? I mean, how did that feel?
Yeah, it was. I mean, they say be careful when you meet your heroes. Sometimes it doesn't live up, but in this case, it's completely the opposite. I mean, he is every bit as kind and gracious as he appears to be, and so. Playing with him that first time, I mean, let's just say I was having trouble remembering where I was in the music, because I was just like, is this really happening? Am I really playing with this guy, whose music I've adored for so long, and after a while, I was a familiar face for him. And so he basically just started addressing me by name when he would say, Jim, I think that could be a little shorter, or that could be a little, so it became a very friendly atmosphere. And I still went back and played even after I moved to, I mean, definitely while I was in Utah, and even a few years after I was here, I still kept going back and playing a bit with the Boston Pops. And of course, I would always try to make it work when it was John Williams week, and because the Boston Symphony only has 3 trombone players, a lot of times they use a lot of extras, just because if there's any orchestra in this country that should have 4 trombones, it's them. Just the amount of playing they do. With exception to Boston and LA Phil, I mean, I think Pittsburgh sees John Williams probably more than any other orchestra in terms of, he's recorded here, he's been here many times, and he definitely loves this orchestra. And I mean, I bet just past 92. It's pretty amazing that he's still doing it, still.
And I don't think he has plans to retire anytime soon.
I don't think so either. I mean, I have so many wonderful John Williams stories. Like one of my favorites is I heard this secondhand that I've heard he's very regimented in the way he works. Like he gets up and has something to eat and maybe does some kind of exercise and then writes for a certain number of hours, takes lunch and writes. Like he's very, very planned out. It's not just and that he's so regimented that I guess there was one year where his son has one of his sons has keys to his house and just kind of comes and goes, and one morning he walks in and his son's at the eating breakfast or something, and he goes, "Oh, I didn't know you were coming to visit." And he goes, "Dad, it's Christmas Day." Like he didn't even realize it was Christmas Day because he's just so disciplined about, like, he goes, "Oh yeah, it is."
Well, I can confirm the regiment because we have lots of friends that work for John. So usually what he does is he wakes up, he writes, he goes to play a couple holes of golf at the Bel Air Country Club.
Excellent.
That's his exercise. Then he comes back, he writes some more. He has lunch. The same thing every day. It's Gelson's egg salad sandwich and Lay's potato chips. And and then he works a little more, and then he goes and he hangs out at the Bel Air Base Country Club, whatever that one, on PCH for a little bit sometimes, and then rinse and repeat the next day. So he is a creature of habit. Yeah. So I'm told
for sure.
from my friends that work with him that see this every day.
Wow.
So, it's like geniuses. They don't like to think about change. They just want to, it's like same thing like Steve Jobs, and, they just want the same thing over and over every day expected. So I think even when he's touring, they try to keep the same kind of schedule for him as well.
Yeah. You could really tell when he's here how protected that is, but one of my absolute favorite memories of his, though, is when I was freelancing in Boston. This one particular year, the Red Sox made a playoff run, and actually, this is particularly poignant given that Seiji Ozawa just passed away, because they made a playoff run, and the Boston Symphony they got asked to send a brass section to play the national anthem at the game, right? And so John Williams and Seiji Ozawa were involved, and Seiji just wanted to be involved. He like played bass drum or something. He didn't even conduct. He wanted to, because he was such a baseball guy. And so we show up for this thing, and it was sort of in the gap between their regular season and Tanglewood. So like some of the trombone players were out of town, and so they called me to play. And it was me and Doug Yo and another freelancer with the trombone section. And so we show up for this thing, and it's and we're rehearsing just a totally straight up the middle B flat major national anthem, and we play through it once, and John just sits there for about maybe 30 seconds, and he's just sits there and thinks, and he goes, "Okay," and then he just off the top of his head just starts changing the arrangement. He's like, "Okay, second trumpet here in bar 3, change that to an E flat, and change this. Okay, we'll go F, eighth notes, F, G flat here. Let's make this a G flat major chord. You play," and he starts pointing at people. We're all furiously writing this down, and he basically is making it into a John Williams arrangement, and he goes, "Okay, so everybody got that?" We're all still furiously writing, and he says, let's try it. And he conducts through it, and now it's a John Williams arrangement. Like that big chord at the end, that was a G flat major chord instead of a B flat major chord, and to give you some sense of it. It just sounded so cool, And just off the top of his head, we read it once, and he was like, "Okay, that works, and we'll do it from memory." And I was like, okay, and I mean, that rehearsal was at like 1:00 and the game was later that day, so I think I ran through that, and I'm a terrible memorizer. So I think I ran through that part like 1,000 times between that and the game. And then, being out on the field with like, tens of thousands of fans screaming, and like the team is like standing right there waiting, for us to play. And John Williams is conducting, and Seiji Ozawa is playing bass drum. I love it. It was the weirdest thing. And, it was super exciting. But.
Amazing. I have greetings from Jason Gamer, and also an incriminating photo of your quintet here I'm going to share now.
So
Ooh.
there it is.
Man,
Pretty good for all
look at
our
that.
listeners at home. There's your Bach, I think. Looks like a Bach 42.
Yeah, look at that. My hairline's like here, I think. You know?
Anyway, he says
Well,
hi, and you should hit him up. So
oh, definitely.
he says he loves
definitely.
you. So
Oh, right
there
back
you go.
at him. Right back
There you
at him.
go.
He was
Jason Gamer,
he
good
was
guy.
yeah, he's great. He's great.
Well,
Great.
since we're
Yeah,
so
we had a
close
lot
to
of fun
Valentine's
together.
Day, this is spreading the love on the Trombone
That's right.
Corner. Hey,
Oh my
Jim, I was
gosh.
wondering, you talked about your auditions a little bit, with Utah and then again in Pittsburgh. Could you take us a little bit more deeper into what your preparation looked like? I mean, you said you played with your colleagues in Utah and they helped you out, but what did your individual practice look like during those times?
Well, I, uh, I'm avid about, let's just put it, how do I put this? To avoid the family history I have with regard to health. So I'm pretty, avid weightlifter and runner, and just trying to stay on top of my health. Because if you track my family tree, it's like heart disease comes for all of us, it seems, and so I'm really adamant about keeping, on top of that. And I only mention that because if I knew what I know now about exercise physiology when I was a student, I would have been a much happier practicer. It took me a while to figure out how to balance those two elements, like the athletic element of playing the instrument and versus the psychological and musical aspects of playing. So when I coach students on prepping auditions now, my preparation, especially in those later auditions that I took, because my audition history was very sporadic. You'd think, I took, Pittsburgh was my 39th professional orchestra audition. I didn't come to it easily. Auditioning was very difficult for me. Nerves were always a real issue for me. And, I didn't have that sort of Midas touch of auditions that many folks listen to. Like I remember, I think wasn't it your guys' first episode that you interviewed David Rahano from LA Phil? It's like, did he not? Did he know what it was like to not make it out of a prelim? I don't think he did.
I don't
Like,
think so. Yeah.
And so I know other players. I think Toby Oft said once that the prelim round of an audition is like the mud pit, where you're just trying to stand up, you're trying to get a footing, I couldn't agree more, because it's so hard that first round. And so for me, getting the preparation set up properly took a while. It was a lot of experimentation for me of balancing the two, aspects, the sort of physical and the mental side of things. And so now, when I coach students in preparing auditions, I have this whole physical preparation method that I do where, I have them take the list, no matter how long the list is. And it's sort of, I call it like the scroll practice, where the first day you start at the beginning of the list and you play straight through, no rests, just skip all the rests, and you play until you hit a wall, because you will hit a wall. And then you take a break and then keep going. And then you keep taking breaks as you need to. But you go through the entire list. And then on day 2, you start on excerpt 2 and go all the way through the list. And now the first excerpt becomes the last excerpt, and so on. So it's like every day it scrolls down one excerpt. And you plan it out in such a way that by the time you get to the week of the audition, you have played through every version of that list in terms of, so that way, from a physical standpoint, what every excerpt feels like fresh and what every excerpt feels like shot. And, when I prep for, I haven't taken an audition in a long time. But I still prep heavy concerts. When I do my, obviously we have to crack we have to crack open the case of me doing overdubs and stuff, and that whole world for me. But when I do my
So the Nova
trombones at the
dubs.
movies, Nova dubs. That's
The Nova
right.
dubs.
That's right.
We'll get into that. That's coming.
Yeah, trademark, right? Yeah. When I do those movies concerts, I mean, I've been to, let me see, I think I've been to like 78 different schools at this point in the last 11 years, and so whenever I prep those concerts, I mean, they're brutal. I mean, those concerts, the parts I play on those concerts make an audition look like, an entrance exam for a youth orchestra, it's like, but I prepare it the same way, except I don't scroll it. I just literally play through, everything straight through. Cause that, in a concert, it's going to be in that order. So I just played in that order. Whereas for auditions, I basically decided that I was going to treat auditions, in such a way that my preparation would be far harder than any possible permutation of the audition. I'd set up my nightmare round, like what would be the worst excerpt to start with? What would be the worst one to follow that? What would be the worst one to end the round with, that kind of thing. And it really, ended up paying off because, I remember my semifinal audition here for Pittsburgh. I was on stage for like 40 minutes. And, I think the list was an entire page long of excerpts. And I played every excerpt at least twice. Like they would say, "Can you play that again and do this? Can you do this? Can you do that? Can you play this a little longer? Can you play this softer? Can you more legato?" And so having that foundation of strength there that allowed me to, finish strong, because the last excerpt they wanted to hear was Tannhäuser, so it's like, oh, thanks. Oh, and because of the way I prepare physically, I had been there, done that. So I knew what Tannhäuser would feel like fried, and then I could just people ask me now, how do I manage nerves, under pressure? And I was like, well, that's part of it, is that I try to arrive at any pressure situation, feeling as if, I've turned every rock over that I can. I've done everything I can to prepare, so it'll be what it'll be, and that really kind of takes the pressure off. I think a lot of times when people feel nervous, it's because there's a certain feeling of they don't know, like they're unsure about something, or they don't know what's going to happen. And so the more parts of your preparation you can prepare in a rigorous way, the less those factors matter, like the whole, I mean, because like that's what's funny about playing this movies show that I have done, which is continually evolving. I'm always adding new arrangements and taking ones away and updating them and stuff. But I've always found it funny that something uniquely wrong happens at every one of those concerts. Like something that either I frack a note I've never had a problem with before, or the conductor, misses a cue, or cuts off too early, or somebody plays a wrong note somewhere that I've never heard played wrong, or I misspeak something, whatever. It's something always happens uniquely different. So I just kind of find that, in a way, I'm like, well, that's live music for you. I mean, one of my favorite Glenn Dodson stories. I mean, he was like a second father to me. I mean, I heard your interview about, where John interviewed you. I think this was early on. You talked about Byron Peebles, and
Yeah.
I had much the same. That resonated a lot with me. That's how I felt about Glenn Dodson. He was like a second father to me. And I was the kind of student who would go to, like if the Philadelphia Orchestra was playing Brahms' Second Symphony, I would go to all three performances. I would not just go to one. I would go to all three, because I'd learn something different from each performance, And this one particular run, I remember, Friday performance went great. Sunday performance went great. Saturday performance, not so great. Just, the high D scale, like just something went haywire, something didn't go right. It wasn't a big deal. In retrospect, it was not a big deal. But as a student, I was like, oh no, I didn't know what to think. And so that was a Sunday, last performance is on a Sunday. On Monday morning, I have my lesson, and I come into my lesson. I was like, so Mr. Dodson, I want to ask you a question, but I'm kind of nervous to ask you. And he goes, what? What do you mean? What could you be nervous to ask me? I was like, so I went to all 3 performances of the orchestra, and because I would always hang out at the stage door for him afterwards. So he's like, yeah, I know you, and I was like, so how do you deal with like having a rough night, and he's like, he kind of had to think about it for a second, because he had already like, the whole like the Ted Lasso thing, be the goldfish. He had already forgotten about it. He had already sort of put it behind him, and he had to think about it. He goes, oh yeah, Saturday. Yeah, I didn't quite get my arms around it on Saturday, or something like that. He said, I didn't quite nail it on Saturday. And I was like, so how do you, because Sunday was so great, how do you deal with that? And he goes, well, Jim, you just got to accept it's live music, like some days you're the windshield, some days you're the bug. It's just the way it is, and you just have to hit it hard and wish it well, And I'll never forget that, because that still happens to me, where, and I'm sure it will continue to happen, where I go for some big moment in a particular concert, and something weird happens, and you just gotta push forward through that, So yeah, I just find it sometimes the old wisdom is new again kind of thing.
That's the beautiful thing about live performance too, I think. Just it's humans making art for you in real time. And it's not always perfect, but
exactly.
That's the
and
beautiful thing.
That's also part of the excitement of it too.
Absolutely.
Is that, something unique can happen every concert, and you're breathing, literally in our case, breathing new life into these ink blots on the page and making them become something different.
Absolutely. I always try to think, remind myself that it's a trombone and it's supposed to sound like a trombone, and that includes all the warts and non-warts. So, it is still a slide trombone. It has its own nuances. Let's talk about some of your gear, because I see it all sitting behind you, and I've been waiting 50 minutes to talk to you about all your stuff. So I'd love to hear about your Shires instruments and, your mouthpieces that you've designed with Greg Black and all that stuff.
Yeah. It's funny. I was not a gear guy until, kind of later in my career, when I got to Curtis, I just had this Bach 42 with a 5G, and that's it, and that's what I played on. I messed around with mouthpieces a little when I was a student, but I kept kind of falling back into, the big revelation that I went through was, my upper lip especially is particularly sensitive to silver. And I didn't realize that until I got to Curtis, and Glenn Dodson played on gold plated mouthpieces. And we realized 2 things: that he's like, your skin is, he's like, I don't have a full blown allergy to silver, but I definitely am. It gets tacky for me. I can play on a silver plated mouthpiece for about 15 minutes before it starts to become really adhesive to my upper lip. And on top of that, I can't shave with a regular razor. I have to like kind of use a clipper to shave my upper lip, because if I close shave it, it's a disaster, and these are things you don't think about when you're a kid from Connecticut, so that Glenn Dodson kind of steered me through that a little bit. He's like, I think you should probably use a clipper to shave your upper lip. And then, he said, why don't you try a gold plated mouthpiece? And that was like a revelation to me, because then all of a sudden I could make shifts easier. It was just more comfortable and that kind of thing. But when I got to Boston, Steve Shires had just opened his factory, like, and moved it out of his garage. And Norman Bolter, I was just like, my Bach, I felt like it's kind of I felt like I was being held back a little bit by it. I wanted to explore other horns, and so Norman had his horn, which was, he's always been more of a Con 88H kind. I mean, he had a Bach 42 that he played a lot as well in Boston. In fact, he had a Monette trombone at one point that was just a straight horn. That's what they're playing on those that old Spielberg Williams project with the Boston Pops. They're all playing on Monette trombones, if you can believe it. It's like Norman Bolter, Doug Wright, Darren Acosta, and Doug Yo, and they're all playing on these Monette trombones. So he had 3 trombones that he would kind of cycle through, but he generally treated his 88H as his home base. So when he went out to Shires, Steve made him a horn that was basically what would become the vintage New York or vintage Elkhart, bell and that kind of thing. And so that's the horn I tried. And I was like, and even his eyes got wide when I played it. And I was like, man, this feels so much better than my horn. And not to get too, I mean, I guess that's the whole point of this podcast is to get into the weeds of trombone gear
here. We get pretty geeky. Yeah.
I'm a real high placement player. Like my mouthpiece, when I place it, is like literally right under my nose. And so the majority of my mouthpiece is above the split between my lips. And so I spin the air really fast. And so that's why I tend to play on big equipment. It's not because it's because I need the room, And so when I went out to Shires, I lean towards a bass crook slide, like a Bach 42 style slide, and an axial valve. And I played at that point. He wasn't offering the T2 mandrels yet, And it's because my first Shires trombone, when I went out to the factory, much like the way I was explaining how I play excerpts, like preparing excerpts to be able to play them tired and fresh. I went out there once with fresh chops and tried horns, and then I went out there once, like after a couple rehearsals in the the NEC orchestra, so I could be kind of tired when I tried, because I wanted to see whether I would gravitate towards the same equipment. And sure enough, I did. And I remember Steve, like, he let me try some stuff, and then when I finally found, like, I was like, yeah, I want this horn, I want this bell, this, and he was like, he kind of shook his head. He goes, okay, you can take that. I'm going to get in some trouble though, because that horn was supposed to be shipped out today for a customer, and blah, blah, like that was supposed to go. So he had to like go back.
Sounds familiar.
Yeah, I know.
Old Steve Shires line. Yeah.
Yep. I know. He's a good friend, an old friend, but I know him well. And so, but he let me leave with that horn. And I think at the time it was somewhat to Steve's credit that, I was just this kid from grad school. I was a grad student. I wasn't, I wasn't doing any of the things I'm doing now. And I think he could hear, he's like, this kid's gonna become something, And so he let me leave with that horn. And I mean, that first horn I had didn't have a serial number on it.
Yeah. Well, he also knows, like, as a trombonist himself, like, he knows how important it is when you find one that matches. Like, you'll then go crazy trying to find another one that matches. So if it's a hit, he's like, okay, I'll just make another one. This one's yours.
Yeah. Yeah. Especially since it was clear that horn was going to somebody sight unseen,
Yeah. So was it a 2RVE that you ended up with the red bell first? Or?
Actually, no, you won't believe it. It was a 2R. It was like the heaviest red bell that he made at the time, and the only way you could get a heavier one is if he custom made it for you, like of the standard bells, it was like the heaviest one. It was a 2R, but I played an axial valve and a TB-47 slide, except back then, the slides were longer. The standard slides were like what the old box slides were. And that's what I actually still play on now. I technically my slide is a TB-47L. Mm-hmm. And same thing with my bass slide. They're both long slides. And I attribute that largely to the fact that I'm such a high placement player, and I spin the air so fast that I need the space. And when I play a standard, because he changed the standard length to be the shorter version, because customer after customer was coming to him asking to cut their tuning slides, and so he eventually just made the slides shorter, because I'm a big believer in the fact that if you pull your tuning slide out too far, gaining the pitch length you need in the tuning slide is not great because it's not proportional. You know,
It's
the tuning
straight
slides are
pieces.
different.
You're absolutely right.
You know,
Yep.
it kind of, I think it affects the way the horn centers. And so I would rather gain the length in the slide and where it's proportional, you know, and, people look at me like I'm nuts until they try it.
Well, that's why tuning in the slide horns works so well, I think.
Yeah, that's why
But
my alto works so well. You know,
but you what you gain, you have a heavier slide, and some people don't like that either. And it definitely slots a lot different on the tuning in the slide with a full conical J bend. You definitely notice the slots are different on an instrument like that.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. And I played on that for a while, but then when I got to, I mean, my horn collection, I didn't actually. I'm trying to think when I got an alto. My horn. I mean, now you see a whole pile of them there, but like, although my pile's nothing compared to yours, Noah.
I am the
Uh-oh,
biggest freak for sure.
Here we go.
Yeah. No, it's great. It's great. Actually, the first time I ever heard Noah's name was a friend of mine, Craig Moore, who's a bass trombone player, freelances in Salt Lake City, and he was telling me about the Brass Ark.
I shipped him a bell this morning, if you can believe it.
I completely believe it. I totally believe it. Craig's a good friend. Yeah, he's terrific player. But yeah, I when I was freelancing in Boston, whenever I would play with them, when Ron Barron would play alto, they, if I was playing second, they would basically lend me a horn and say, play on this like 525 bore horn because it just blends better with the alto and bridges the gap between the bass, better. And so they would lend me this, Con, like, what is it, 6H? Is that their 525 bore horn?
78H?
Or is it 78H? I can't remember. It was
bore?
Ron. Yeah, it was a medium bore
78
Con.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and so I ended up just buying a Shire's equivalent of that, like an 8-inch 2 RVE bell. I mean, the bell was so light that like stern language would dent it. I mean, it was just paper thin, and but it was beautiful. And so I had that horn, and I had a Yamaha like custom alto that was, I think, basically a copy of a Lech. I think it was their custom series that they made. So I had that alto until Shire started making altos. But the big shift was when I got a bass trombone, because when I auditioned here for Pittsburgh, they didn't require the use of bass trombone, but the list was all over the map. It was like, because they wanted to make the second job into somewhat of a utility position. I heard your interview with Martin Skippers. I played a, I'm laughing because I played a festival with him in January of 2020 it was the Korean Trombone Festival. And while I was there, I got really sick with what I thought was the flu. And about halfway through the week, I remember sitting down to have lunch with Martin and Tomer Maschowski and Nate Sconce, and I was just dumping salt on the food. And I was pumped full of flu and cold medicine, trying to just power through. And Nate was like, "What are you doing, man? This is Korean food. This stuff is so salty." And I was like, "It's just kind of bland to me."
Oh, no.
So I'm pretty sure I had OG COVID,
that was January of 2020.
Yep.
Oh, wait a minute. Martin came and visited us later.
That's right. Yeah.
Yep. That's right. So it's my wife likes to say I'm patient zero, that I brought it to the US. And I was like, but it was here long before that. So but anyway, when I heard Martin talking about being a Vexel player and how that's sort of more common in Europe, but it's not as common in the US. Well, when Pittsburgh had its second audition, that's what they were sort of trying to make the second job be, a utility job. And so they put a lot of really low excerpts on it, in addition to Zarathustra and Planets and stuff that, high excerpts too. But they wanted somebody who could play who could play bass trombone, basically in all things but name. They didn't require the use of it, but they put like third trombone parts to Alpine Symphony and third trombone parts to Mahler 6 and stuff like that required a lot of low playing. And I have one of the geeky tweaks of my tenor, my regular tenor, is I have my F tuning slide is slightly longer so that I can actually pull it and tune the valve to E. And that's what I do whenever I have to play anything with a low C in it that's of any substance, I tune the trigger to E so that I can play that C right in 6.
Very old school.
Yeah, and that's what I did in the audition. And Murray Crew, he basically said, "Yeah, you were the only one who could play it in tune when you played. Everyone else was a little sharp, And he was like, that was so cool. You pulled your tuning slide, and I was like, well, it just makes it a lot easier. I remember joking with Steve about building me a double valve tenor, and as is usually the case when I ask these guys this stuff, they're usually like, "You're out of your mind, Nova." But yeah, we can do that. We could do that if you really want to do that. We could, So
we'll do anything for money, I guess. Right?
yeah. But he was like, if you put 2 valves on a tenor, it'll completely change the weight of the horn, and you're gonna have to adjust your bell and all that kind of stuff. So you really want to go down this rabbit hole. So, but when I got the job, I was like, okay, I'm not, because the idea was that this person would be able to play bass on, children's concerts and things like that, lighter rep, to give some rotation time to the bass trombone player, to Murray. And now Pete Sullivan is very chill principal trombone player, like great leader musically and deportmentally. He's a really, I think part of the reason he's such a great principal player is because he spent a large part of his early career as a second trombone player. So I think he just understands what it's like to be in the middle. And so he leads that way, and he's a great colleague, great friend, but he was like, not adamant that, oh, you got to switch to Yamaha now or anything like that. He's like, I want you to play what you're comfortable on. And he was like, you don't need to get a bass trombone. You got great low chops, but me, I was the one who was like, well, hold on a second. I'm not going to sit in Murray Crew's chair on tenor, even if I can play the notes. Like, that's just not right. So that's when I set out to get a bass trombone and figure out how to use that G flat valve and the double valves and stuff. And Murray was basically my first bass trombone teacher. I tried playing on regular size bass trombone mouthpieces, but it was just, it's just too big for me. I couldn't center. I felt like I was sticking my face into a bird bath. It was just too big. I mean, so Greg Black, made me a couple of mouthpieces that basically had the 3 rim that I play on just about every mouthpiece, but with 1.5 G and 2 G cups, like some variants and different backbores and stuff. And he helped me work that out. To take a step back, when I first got to Utah, that's when I decided to make the big switch with mouthpieces, because I wanted to play something that would let me play broader on second, but I could still play first, because the job in Utah was assistant principal, as a second/assistant principal. So I'd play lots of first in the orchestra. And so I contacted Greg, and Greg had made me a copy of my 5G on his blank. And that's what I had been playing on for a long, long time. And so I've known Greg since 1999 or 98 or something like that, maybe even earlier. It's hard to remember. We've been friends for so long. But I went at it kind of a different way than, and this sort of is in a way, this is sort of an allegory for my equipment choices. Is like, I get an idea in my head and then I just go with it. And most people slowly get bigger from whatever they're playing. I think they experiment a little bit bigger, a little bit bigger. I decided to go the other way. I decided to start at what would be the biggest tenor mouthpiece he makes, like a straight 3G, his straight 3G, which I think is a little bit bigger than a Bach 3G. So, I just jumped into the deep end of the pool, and I figured I'm not going to stay on that. I'll just start there and then slowly whittle my way back into, smaller and smaller versions. But I found that because of the way I anchor embouchure wise, it was actually much more comfortable to play on that wider rim. I was actually getting, because if you figure that, I'm placing so high that the vibrating surface relatively, is narrow, versus if somebody's playing a 5G and they're placing 50-50, they're probably getting a wider vibrating surface than I am with a 3G placing higher. You know what I mean? So, and so I just started with a 3G. Now, you remember I mentioned my friend Gary Offenlock? Well, he, master practical joker, had a Bach 1.5G at home, and he took it and he like polished it up so it looked brand new. And then at the break of the first rehearsal that I was playing that 3G on, he like found where my horn was like on break and switched the mouthpiece and put a 1.5G in there. And I was playing first. And at the end of the break, people are walking up to me saying, "Hey, so you got a new mouthpiece? Let me hear let me hear something. Like, play something high." They wanted to hear me play bolero, doesn't Beethoven 5 have like a really high trombone part? And I was like sitting there trying to blast out high Fs on a 1.5G, and I didn't realize it until halfway through the second half of rehearsal. I was like just sitting there and I look down and I go, I don't remember that rim being so thin when I took, and then I look at the side and I realize this is Bach 1.5G, and I look right at Gary, and he's been sitting there waiting the whole time for me to figure it out. And you're like, "What?" I goes, "What do you mean, what? Only you would do this, you jerk. Like, you just took 5 years off my career, for crying out loud," And then, Rusty McKinney, the bass trombone player, and Gary were both like, Jim, it was kind of funny at first, but then you just kind of beat the crap out of that thing. You just made it do, you just kind of made it do what you wanted it to do. And so that was my sort of first experience with mind over metal, as it were, like I didn't know that I was expecting it to feel bigger, but I didn't even, and that perspective actually really changed a lot of things for me. Because after that, I realized that, yes, equipment has to match your concept and has to match like your body to a lot of ways. But, as I like to say to students sometimes, is like, whether you believe in intelligent design or evolution, I think both sides can agree that going into a brass cup to create art is not necessarily what your chops were designed for.
Love it.
So
And
you have to start with the inherent weirdness of it and go from there.
It's
and now you
tunable
have your
farts
own
after all.
series.
Exactly.
You have your own series of mouthpieces with Greg now.
Yeah, he approached me a couple years ago about it because, like, when I got the bass trombone mouthpiece sorted out, and then when I decided to Nick Schwartz let me borrow his Contra at one point. This was after I'd started doing the overdubs really heavily, and I tried it, and I was just like, boy, this is a cool sound. It's like a bass trombone that swallowed 3 bass trombones, and it's like the core of that sound. It's such a cool sound. I had no idea how to play it. I just started messing around with it, and I asked him if I could borrow it. And so, after a while of just using my regular bass trombone mouthpiece, I had Greg make me a Contra mouthpiece, and we went through a couple of versions of that. And then I got a soprano trombone, and soprano trombones are designed to be played by a trumpet player. So
I've heard. Yep.
Okay, here it comes. Let's see it, John. All right, John's been waiting for this moment. Here it is.
Oh, excellent. You have all the proper licenses and everything for that, right? Yeah.
Working on those still.
He likes to fancy himself a trombonist sometimes.
Right. Well, the soprano trombone is such an interest. It presents such an interesting conundrum because it's built for a trumpet player, really, in terms of how you spin the air and play it. But trombone players, typically trumpet players don't have slide technique, and so managing the slide and dealing with that is the real issue. And so a trombone player playing a soprano trombone, it's like we have the slide technique and awareness, but kind of getting used to spinning the air in that way is very is very challenging at first. And that was the big thing. Cause I told Greg I was going to I have a Miraphone, soprano trombone, and I had to have a whole inch cut off of it to get it up to pitch. Like it was just flat as a pancake, when I would play it. And, I called Greg and I said, hey, I want to get the soprano trombone. I know it's going to be a weird ask, but can you make a soprano trombone mouthpiece that has a trumpet shank and cup and backbore, but has a trombone width rim? And he kind of took a second. He goes, Nova, you're out of your bleeping mind, but yeah, I can make that for you. I can make that. And he said he had to start from scratch because all his trumpet blanks weren't wide enough and all his trombone blanks were too bored out. And so he basically had to just start with the raw bar stock and create this mouthpiece. And this was back when he was still in New Jersey. I remember driving out there, talk about extremes, like, because we were in total uncharted territory, making a contra mouthpiece that worked for someone like me and the soprano mouthpiece that worked. So I went out to this was back when he was still in New Jersey. It was right before he moved back to North Carolina. And I went out there and we spent the better part of a day. I drove out there really early in the morning and we, just worked on stuff for a long time. And we came up with something. And then when I took it back, I sent my horn out to get that inch cut off of it. And that's how I'm able to play this thing, and it's, the soprano trombone is, shall I say, a very low percentage instrument in terms of like navigating it live. I mean, I've played it live for sure. And like the only person I know who plays maybe more soprano trombone than I do is Wycliffe Gordon, and he sort of inspired me actually, and the only reason, same with the contra, the only reason that I even explored it was because I just kept pushing the limits on my overdub recording stuff. I would arrange stuff and I'd be like, let me see, what if I try this? What if I, and it's like, when, as we all know, the buzz is the buzz. So if you can't play the note, if you can't make the note happen on whatever, the gear is not going to create that sound for you. Like if you don't have the embouchure strength or, air speed awareness to make a buzz that high, you're not going to be able to play it on soprano trombone. Like my daily routine that I go through is, one of my students affectionately refers to it as P90X for your chops. It's like meant to like
love it.
Work, and it's meant to be it's not a warm up. It's a routine. It's an exercise program. It's meant to keep my chops at battle readiness, as it were, like I can do that. And it takes me, if I'm taking my time, it takes me a little over an hour. If I kind of move through it quicker, I can do it in about 45 minutes. But, and it was interesting to hear Martin Skippers talk about this. Like, I will do my daily routine on my tenor. But if I'm playing bass trombone in the orchestra, I'll play it on bass and I'll play the same routine, which means all the crazy high stuff I play on the bass. In fact, that's one of the ways I utilize my, at this point, it's not fair to call it doubling. It's like quintupling or whatever, is I like one of the solos I play in a lot of the trombone choir concerts I do is the theme to the Green Hornet, this arrangement that I play that it's like a, basically a jazz version of Flight of the Bumblebee. Well, when I'm working it up, I have a practice track that I use that's 10% faster than the tempo I intend to play it. And I work it up on bass trombone. And that way, when I play it on my, 525 bore horn, it's like armor piercing rounds, it's just like, it feels like a piece of cake, but yeah, I only ever do my routine on either the tenor or the bass. I don't have an alto trombone routine. I don't have a contrabass routine or anything like that. That's where the recordings come in. All the overdub recordings is where I practice those horns and hone those horns. I mean, before I started doing overdubs, I was not even remotely comfortable sight reading on alto trombone. I had to like sit down and learn the parts. Now I can sight read on alto, pretty well. And my contra sight reading is getting better. I definitely still have to work things up. I mean, my first contra was a Canstol, and which again has a bell that is like, stern language will dent it. That's what Nick has, and he let me borrow his, and I ordered one, and I had that for a while. And the Pittsburgh Symphony did a Danny Elfman show, and there's a contra bass book in that. There's 5 trombones, a contra, 2 basses, and 2 tenors. And Jeff D, our bass trombone player, he doesn't play contra, but I was really delicate about it. I said, Jeff, this is your turf. I'm sort of like the assistant bass trombone player in this orchestra. So like, if you want to play that 5th part on bass, which many people do, I'll just play the 4th part. And he was like, no, don't be silly. You have a contra. You should play the contra part. So it was kind of weird to sit to Jeff's left and sit with Craig, Knox, a tuba player, and that's when I realized, like, the Canstol was a fun horn to play, but I just personally could not. It almost broke me. I could not keep up on that horn, and that's when I decided to go all in and get the Tyne, the Universal, which is, I think more specifically designed to be played in live performance in an orchestra, for a normal human like me, as opposed to Nick. Nick can play any contra and sound like $1 million on it. It's kind of funny how he's such a big guy. Like, he picks that thing up and it looks like a normal trombone in his hand, and I pick up the contra and it's like, Honey, I Shrunk the Nova. It's like I look like
So,
I look like a hobbit playing a trombone.
So we've covered a lot of stuff. I want to make sure we brought up the Nova dubbing a few times. And
Sure.
What's really cool about what you did, I mean, a lot of folks do that now after pandemic with recording themselves and TikTok and all of that sort of thing. But you were doing it way before then. Can you kind of take us through like how you started that? I mean, the writing and then the recording and all of that. And then you actually you teach that now too. Or you've done master classes and stuff how to do that. So take us through the Nova dubs.
Yeah, I mean, when the pandemic hit, boy, my inbox exploded. I mean, I think I remember being like on a phone call with like Koichiro Yamamoto, and Joe Alessi was calling on the other line, and then an email from Craig Mulcahy came in. Like, all these people were like, contacting me at the same time, like, hey, that thing you do, can you show me how to do that now? And it basically started, boy, it's 12 years ago now. And actually, to give the full story, like, you got to go back to when I was a student at Curtis. Glenn Dodson would have these trombone hangs at his house, and he called them bone bashes. And the Curtis studio, the 4 of us would go to his house, and then the Philadelphia Orchestra section would come over, and then there'd be a couple freelancers from town that he knew, and we would play through these insane arrangements for trombone choir that he had done or people had done. And the rule was you had to bring something to play. It could be either something you bought or something you arranged. And that's how I got started arranging. And because of my, love of John Williams, I naturally was doing a lot of John Williams arrangements, And so, 12 years ago, I was just finally the bass trombone having a bass trombone in the lineup opened this door for me, because right before I left Utah, I did a recording session for like one of the World of Warcraft modules or games. I don't actually play that. I mean, I play video games, but I don't play that particular game, but it was some add-on to the game. And the contractor knew that I was playing bass trombone. So he's like, I really want you to come in just by yourself and overdub all 5 trombone parts. Like, we have 3 tenor parts and 2 bass parts. And it's a lot of kind of sinister stuff. And so I went in and I did it. And that planted the seed for me to be like, oh, this is kind of fun to do this stuff all myself, And so, 12 years ago, I was looking for a fun way to get in shape for the season, for the Pittsburgh season. And I was like, what if I took like my Superman arrangement and just recorded all the parts myself? What if I did it all myself? And so that's how that started. Now, I didn't know what I was doing. I had like an old analog microphone that I used to use with my mini disc recorder to like record myself for preparation for auditions. And I put it through an adapter into an old MacBook, and I just used Audacity. And I, like I said about the whole mouthpiece line, like and how I just had this idea in my head, and I just threw effort at it until I came up with something. And then I didn't know anything about, somebody was like, "Oh, you really should pan all the tracks when you record." I was like, "What is it? What does that mean? What does the frying pan have to do with record?" And they're like, No. That means like you spread the voices out, and you should use this, and you should use this program. And so like, I know just enough to be dangerous, I guess, like I know enough to do my own thing. And I have, I've learned enough about recording technology and stuff to be dangerous, But when I started that overdub stuff, I put it on SoundCloud, and I thought, okay, maybe a couple people will listen to it, but my SoundCloud is like, I think it's closing in on 2 million listens.
Holy
my SoundCloud
cow.
page, and so who would have thought, and then, the movies concerts started because, I made these recordings, and back in the day, I wouldn't actually write out an arrangement, like through a weird turn of luck, when I was in high school, we didn't have we didn't have any French horn players in my band. And we had like 2 good trombone players, 2 good trumpets, and a tuba player. We wanted to play brass quintets. And so my band director basically taught me how to read F horn. And so I can read F horn pretty much as well as I can read tenor, alto, treble, clefs, right? So I would just open scores up to John Williams tunes and just like start recording parts until it sounded complete, And then John Whitaker, who's a trombone teacher at the University of Alabama, he called me and messaged me on like Facebook or something. And he was like, "Hey, we really want you to come down here and do a concert of your arrangements. Would you be into that?" And I was like, "Well, problem is I haven't actually written them out." And so I had to go back and like forensically like write them out from my recording, and listen to each voice and stuff. So after that point, that's when I was like, okay, I'm not doing that again. So I now I always do the arrangement first, and it's recording. So I can take risks. I can take chances. I can mess around with the soprano trombone. I can mess around with the contrabass trombone, and the ones and zeros don't lie. So it's like it's an incredibly effective way to practice. Like as opposed to playing through etudes and that kind of thing. I mean, which I think are extremely valuable, but recording yourself. I mean, I'm sure every teacher worth their salt will tell a student that recording yourself is one of the quickest ways to improve. Is to like record yourself, record your lesson. Well, overdubbing, that's all you're doing. Is listening back, adjusting, and you do a little bit at a time, and that's how I do it now. That's my process is the same as when I first started doing with Audacity and a plug-in USB mic, as opposed to the fancy gear that I have now. The process is the same and the goal is the same. And it takes me a long time. I mean, overdubs are. I'm not fast at it. I mean, I can whip one off pretty quick for demo, like when I teach the overdub class, I usually do like a couple phrases of something to show people how I do it. But when I'm actually doing the recording stuff, I'm doing, and I don't do takes. That's the other thing. People were like, "I'd love to hear your outtakes." And I was like, "Well, I don't save those." Like what I actually do is I have a Bluetooth page turner that's toggled as the recording. It's the recording button. And so it's set up so that I hit that foot pedal, it starts recording. And if I don't like what just happened, I hit that pedal and it's like a time machine. It goes right back to where I started recording, starts recording again. So I just do that until I get the take that I want. And then I'll look, at what parts sort of in octaves with that and record that. So that's in tune, and then add parts that are covering through the fifths and thirds. Like it's not an exact science, but that's basically how I do it. But the my overarching goal with my recordings is to try and capture the most exciting recording that I can that just happens to be technically solid, because if you go it the other way, I mean, early on, I would have these moments where I would record something and it's all solid. It sounds good, but it's boring. And I would just have to, you can't engineer excitement, you can't edit that. And so, I would try to, then I'd have to delete that whole thing and go back and like start over. And then, and it's always a work in progress for me. I'm always trying to get better at doing that. And, so people ask me, how much editing I do and all that kind of stuff. And it's like, well, I actually don't do a lot of editing. I just do a lot of playing until it sounds the way I want to. The only editing I do is usually like after I'm done, if I've got a whole section fixed and I find like, I hear something that's not, maybe a little out of place or a little rhythmically not correct, I might go and nudge it a little bit to fix that, but, I try not to boost anything more than like a decibel or two in terms of balancing. Like I will gladly just go back and play it louder because as we know, it's like when you play a brass instrument loud and soft, the colors change. And so, when I have unisons, for instance, like people will ask me sometimes, why don't you just cut and paste? Why don't you just do it once and cut and paste it 4 times? I was like, well, that sounds different than 4 trombones playing together.
Mm-hmm.
That subtle, mix of those sounds, even if it's me playing 4 times, me playing it 4 times, is different than once louder, mic'd heavier, and that's why I'm convinced that I'm convinced that's why the overdubs are popular, is because they end up sounding like the most incredibly well rehearsed performance that you've ever heard, and also happens to be the most exciting take, and that's why it takes me so long, like that's the other question everyone always asks me is how long do these take you? I'm like, well, about 6 hours per minute of finished. And we're talking like, 12, 14 parts or something like that. I mean, some of the Star Wars arrangements on my album were 19 parts, in fact, that's one of my favorite John Williams stories too. Like I saw him backstage at a Boston Pops concert, and this was after my overdubs had started to kind of become popular. And I mentioned it to him. I was like, hey, I'm doing these arrangements of your music and for trombone choir. And the people seem to really respond to them. They're a lot of fun. And he was like, oh, that's really cool. He's like, how many parts are we talking? 4 or 5 parts? And I said, well, actually, John, some of them are 19 parts. And his eyes kind of got wide. He was like, really? It's like, I would like to hear that. And I was like, sure, and I'll send you some stuff. And so I sent him my Superman reboot that I did, where I added like soprano trombones and contras and all that. That's like 20 parts plus percussion and timpani and stuff. And I sent him that. And that's right between those bells right there is he sent me a handwritten letter, like, thanking me and congratulating me on this sound. I mean, it was hand addressed too,
How cool.
Yeah. And, so, and then, like his last visit, we didn't chat this last visit, but he visited a couple years ago, and I actually got to sit with him for about 15 minutes or so. And we just chatted, and I just kind of asked him all these questions about, he told me how he settled the rumor that trombone was actually his first instrument, and that he studied with a guy in New York. And he's like, I love the trombone. And I gave him a score to my Star Wars album, and it was pretty cool.
How neat.
We chatted a bit about it. Yeah.
So and correct me if I'm wrong, you're doing a project now for ITF coming up pretty soon. Is that correct?
Yeah. I'm a featured guest or featured artist, on this summer's ITF, and I'm the goal for my concert. It's a trombone choir concert, of course, and it's going to be what I want to do is perform arrangements that have never been performed live. Because this trombone at the movies program I do, I'm kind of always adding to it, and so I've kind of pulled together some different stuff that I have already recorded, and then I'm in the process now of recording some new arrangements, and I decided to delve into the Indiana Jones catalog, as it were. And I recorded this new arrangement that if you guys want to take a little sneak peek at.
Do we get to hear it?
Yeah.
Now, awesome.
This new arrangement has never been, it's not, I haven't released it yet, largely because I'm waiting to coordinate with the timpani player in the Pittsburgh Symphony. He's graciously agreed to play percussion and timpani and it really this particular arrangement really needs, there's a great snare drum part in this that needs to be recorded. So what you're going to hear now is it's from Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom. It's the Parade of the Slave Children March. I've always loved that tune. It's such a great melody. So what you'll hear now is just the trombone tracks, but it's, I'm pretty happy with how it came out. It's sort of my typical trombone choir size. It's 2 altos, 6 tenors, 2 basses, and a contrabass trombone. So
love it. One of my favorite cues. Can't wait to hear it.
Roll 'em, Preston.
That's awesome.
Holy cow.
Awesome. It's great.
So you can see why I'm.
I think we have a new theme for the Trombone Corner.
Maybe for this episode or something.
Yeah.
really great.
Jim, that's amazing.
Well, you can see why I took umbrage with, he's okay at the soprano trombone. I was like, hey, hang on a second. Wait a minute. I routinely lose sight in my left eye playing that thing like that. What are you talking about here?
I think you got to send the soprano part for John to look at because it would be good. A fun thing about
say that again. You think
you got to send the soprano chart for John to have a look at it so he can play it on his soprano trombone.
I will.
It.
Sure.
I love it.
Maybe I'll corral you into playing at the ITF concert. Play some soprano.
Oh, there you go. Do it live.
Oh dear. Well, I mean,
look what you've gotten yourself into, John.
ITG is the same week, so I mean, I guess I really have to make a decision. Whose corner am I really in?
Yeah, I mean, that's, that a lot of times when I go to play these arrangements, people get it's like a double whammy. They're like, well, he recorded it, so it's playable, but it's so hard. And so I have to kind of qualify, especially when I go to colleges and these poor kids, they're kind of like freaked out, like, oh my God, I want to play this, but it's so hard. And I always say, look, that my recordings are meant to represent what's possible, not what's probable.
Right.
Like live performance is very different. I was like, these recordings are meant to be aspirational. They're meant to kind of push the limit of the medium. And by doing that, you improve the middle part of the medium. You know what I mean? I laughed years ago. The ITF competition piece for the choir division was this piece called Bone Lab, and the alto trombone part had high G's in it. And when it showed up, my student who was playing the alto part, like he looks at the part and he goes, "Mr. Nova, this is your fault." And I was like, I would argue if I disagreed. He goes, "Yeah, these composers are hearing you play these overdubs, and they're like, oh, so you can write that, okay?" And I'm like, well, sorry, but it does kind of put Beethoven 5 in perspective, doesn't it?
Yeah, sure does. Sure does. Well, we'll make sure to have a complaint box for all of the people that are getting high notes in their trombone pieces now, and they can send them to you.
Yeah,
it'll be
I'll
great.
take it. I'll take the heat.
It'll be great. What a lovely recording. Thank you so much for sharing that with us.
It'll be fun. That's definitely going to be part of that ITF program. And I've a bunch of other new arrangements that I'm going to start working on for that concert. I sort of had an aspirational thought of trying to do an entire Indiana Jones concert, but it's, to do all the arrangements and all the recordings in time for the end of May while trying to be full-time trombone player in the Pittsburgh Symphony and teach at Duquesne. It's a lot. Yeah, it's a lot, but I definitely will have some other John Williams arrangements, some other Indiana Jones stuff on that concert. And then some of the ones that have never been performed live. So
amazing.
But yeah, it's a lot of fun.
Amazing. Well, Jim, it's been great having you on. We should wrap this up and definitely have you on for a future episode for some follow-ups. I'm sure if people have questions, they can get in touch with you. How do people find you? That your website, your Facebook?
Yeah, jimnova.com is the easiest way to find me. I have a contact page through there. That's very simple. And my email address is jim@jimnova.com. If you want to just skip all that and go directly, that email address is solid. Chosen so that even us trombone players can remember it.
We'll send all of your complaints to Jim at jimnova.com.
Yeah.
Just kidding. It's been a real pleasure having you on and getting to talk to you about all this stuff. I learned a lot today, and I thank you for that.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me. I'm flattered you guys would ask me to be on. I've been a big fan of your podcast for many years.
Thank you. Well, then you know what's coming.
Yeah. We can't let you go without the final question. So, Jim, if you could leave our listeners with your best piece of advice, what would that be?
Well, I will say that, many times I say that students should listen more, like people should listen more, but that's sort of been overtaken lately for me, especially by, this project, like that Indiana Jones recording represents exactly what I'm about to say, is that make sure that childlike, part of your personality, that fun, ride the roller coaster ride kind of mentality of playing stays healthy. Make sure you're feeding that part of your personality as much as possible. Play music that you have fun playing without worrying about all the technique involved in producing it, and I mean, the elation that I feel when I'm making those recordings and like finally finish a section and it's all done. I have been known to just sit there and listen to the playback and applaud, and I'm just by myself. I'm applauding like a crazy person, but I'm just, and feeding that part of my personality is, that is my biggest piece of advice for people, is to keep that part of your healthy personality, keep that part of your personality healthy.
Absolutely wonderful advice. Jim Nova, thank you for joining us in the Trombone Corner.
Great. Thanks for having me.
Wow. Well, thanks, Jim. That was a really fascinating interview. True pleasure having you in the corner today. I think just so many good little tidbits of knowledge and fascinating story and backstory on Jim. What do you say, John?
Well, I'm a little nervous because he asked me to be on the on the concert at ITF with my soprano trombone.
Oh no,
I
that's
I
true.
don't know if I can get my chops up in time for that, so I'll probably have to politely decline. But I was honored that he would think of me.
He is one of the best
But,
soprano trombone players in the world, as we have established.
Yes, yes. I mean, what I loved about Jim's interview, first of all, the fact that he does so much, besides the teaching and the pedagogy, and he plays in a major symphony orchestra, but I mean, where he finds time to record those Nova dubs, if you will, it's really cool, and it's really cool to see someone that passionate.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean,
He's an inspiration, a monster player. I mean, I just was blown away by that March of the Slave Children from Temple of Doom. It's one of my favorite John Williams cues, and for him to share that with us, super impressive playing. First of all, my goodness, but just like the arrangement itself, just fantastic.
and curse him because I've been singing that in my head since we.
I know it's such a catchy tune.
Yeah, it's almost worse than Small World.
There's a funny story about that. At our recording studio, we had a longtime composer, Kyle Newmaster, that was renting a space, and Kyle is a huge Indiana Jones fan, and we have one of those arcade machines in the studio, as you know, that has like 10,000 games on it. And there's a 1986 Indiana Jones arcade game, and it plays that Slave Children March over and over, and he was like obsessed with this. He would play this game, I don't know, 8 hours a day, something like that, in between writing on his show Blood and Treasure. And we would come in and do work in the break room, and it would just be that March of the Slave Children. So when Jim pulled it out, I just had to smile, because we have kind of a running joke about the March of the Slave Children in like 7-bit at 8-bit, whatever sound it is, at the studio on that thing. So hold on, sorry, the cat is eating a feather here. Get that out of her mouth.
Budgie.
It's not a Trombone Corner podcast without a cat appearance.
Without the cat. And your cat's now making appearances on your Instagram, which I also love.
Absolutely. Along with our raccoons and all the other things and
the squirrels, the critters. You're turning into a Disney movie over there at your place.
I
all
know.
the critters.
I know. Anyway, there's my little fun tidbit for you all to cap off this episode. Thanks for listening to the Trombone Corner.
Thank you for listening. Do us a favor, hit that 5-star review button, which I think you can now do on Spotify. You used to not be able to do that. You can certainly do it in Apple Podcasts and other places. We're also on YouTube Music now. I don't know if we've mentioned this before, but there was a big shift. Google Podcasts just decided to shut down and shift over to YouTube Music. So we are now uploading the podcast over there as well as on YouTube. So you can not watch us on YouTube, although some of them have video, so you can find us on there. But that's it. We have some great guests coming up next month. Thank you again for listening. And until next time, keep on sliding.